The year is 1945, yet the shadows cast by the war stretch far beyond its official end. Behind the smoke of victory parades and the banners of liberation, governments locked away files marked top secret, eyes only, and restricted. Within those files lie truths so disturbing, they were never meant to surface. Historians speak of battles, treaties, and reconstruction, but hidden in sealed vaults and censored testimonies are stories of human experiments, financial betrayals, massacres disguised as liberation, and scientific atrocities transformed into Cold War assets. Each fragment of evidence, faded telegrams, missing trial records, coded directives, pulls us deeper into a reality deliberately buried. These are not myths, nor whispers of conspiracy, but the classified remains of a war where morality was bartered for power. This is not the tale of victory written in textbooks. It is the story governments feared would undermine the order they built from ashes. Tonight we open those forbidden archives. Tonight, we uncover 4 disturbing World War II truths governments tried to lock away. Chapter 1. The Classified Human Experiments of Dachau. In the Bavarian countryside, only a short drive from Munich, stands a place whose very name became synonymous with cruelty, Dachau. Opened in 1933 as the first official Nazi concentration camp, it was long presented as a site of political imprisonment, forced labor, and extermination. But buried within the ruins of its barracks and concealed in the sealed records of post-war tribunals lies another reality, one meticulously documented in files stamped with chilling designations such as Confidential Annex C and Medical Findings Not for Public Release. These files, recovered by Allied troops in the spring of 1945, would not be destroyed. Instead, they were transferred into secret military archives, catalogued, and eventually used in ways few outside intelligence circles could imagine. Dachau was not simply a place of incarceration. It was a vast laboratory where human beings were stripped of their dignity, reduced to test subjects in the name of pseudo-scientific progress. Prisoners, most often political captives, Roma or Jewish victims, were forced into freezing tanks filled with icy water. This experiment, later referenced in Luftwaffe documents as hypothermia resistance trials, aimed to simulate the conditions of German pilots shot down over the North Sea. The men were observed while their bodies shut down, their pulse monitored as life drained away, their reactions logged with clinical detachment. Some survived only to be revived in scalding water baths, their screams echoing across the camp's walls, while others were discarded once the data had been gathered. By the time Allied troops liberated the camp, hundreds had perished under these meticulously orchestrated trials. The evidence was irrefutable. Medical logs seized from Dachau recorded blood pressure measurements, rectal temperatures, heart rates, and detailed notes describing the stages of death. These were not random acts of cruelty, but organized state-sanctioned experiments carried out by trained physicians wearing SS uniforms. Doctors such as Sigmund Rascher, who reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, proudly delivered these findings to the Reich's leadership. Rascher himself called it vital work for the survival of German airmen. But when the war ended, and justice at Nuremberg sought to expose the horrors of Nazi medicine, a darker bargain was struck. Instead of being discarded as tainted evidence, these logs became bargaining chips in a new global conflict, the Cold War, Operation Paperclip. Officially designed to bring German scientists and engineers into the United States, did not stop at rocketry or physics. Buried within its annexes, concealed under euphemistic labels like aviation survival research, were entire sets of Dachau medical records. US Army Medical Corps officials, alongside intelligence officers, argued that this knowledge could not be lost. With Soviet forces also seizing similar files in their occupied zones, a quiet race began, not to prosecute, but to acquire. Prisoner suffering was translated into survival charts, used to establish hypothermia treatment protocols for NATO pilots and Arctic explorers. It was an unspoken truth. The data gathered in agony was deemed too useful to be erased. For decades, this information remained classified, shielded from both academic scrutiny and public outrage. When fragments finally emerged in the 1980s through Freedom of Information requests, they carried a bitter revelation. Western governments had not merely uncovered these atrocities, they had actively preserved and institutionalized them. The argument presented in internal memoranda was chillingly pragmatic. The data is unique, irreplaceable, and could save Allied lives in future conflict. By this logic, the screams of Dachau's victims were transformed into medical footnotes, their deaths rationalized as contributing to the defense of a new world order. Beyond hypothermia, Dachau became the site of chemical warfare experiments. Prisoners were forced to inhale phosgene, mustard gas, and other chemical agents while doctors studied their respiratory collapse. Others were injected with malaria and exposed to experimental treatments in conditions deliberately designed to induce suffering. These trials were often justified as necessary for understanding battlefield medicine. But post-war investigators discovered chilling correspondence where doctors described their subjects not as patients, but as material. These euphemisms served as linguistic shields, allowing systematic murder to masquerade as scientific progress. The truth became still more disturbing when the US Air Force began citing Dachau's findings in survival training manuals well into the 1950s. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, America's Biological and Chemical Warfare Research Center, Dachau's records on gas exposure and hypothermia were quietly integrated into restricted courses. The irony was unescapable. Data gathered through Nazi torture was used to protect Allied soldiers in the nuclear age. The line between justice and complicity blurred until it nearly vanished altogether. The Dachau experiments, though grotesque, were not unique. Similar atrocities unfolded at Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen, and especially Auschwitz. But Dachau's proximity to Munich and its role as a central medical hub for SS experimentation made it the primary archive seized by the Allies. While the Nuremberg doctors' trial sentenced some perpetrators to death, others slipped through the cracks of carefully negotiated immunity agreements. Zygmunt Rascher was executed in 1945, not for his crimes against humanity, but for personal corruption and disloyalty to Himmler. Others, like Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later celebrated as the father of space medicine, built entire careers in the United States, their past conveniently erased under classified seals. What governments did not anticipate was the persistence of survivors. Men like Ernst Heinchen, who had been subjected to freezing experiments and lived to testify, spoke in detail about the agony inflicted on him. Their voices, often dismissed as anecdotal or unreliable in the shadow of hard data, eventually pressured historians and journalists to dig deeper. By the late 20th century, the narrative of Dachau as merely a camp of imprisonment expanded into recognition of its hidden laboratory role. Yet, even today, the full extent of these files remains concealed, portions redacted under claims of national security relevance. The moral weight of Dachau's experiments remains unresolved. How does a society reconcile with the fact that medical protocols designed to save soldiers, astronauts, and Arctic explorers may trace their origins back to the screams of dying prisoners? Can the results of atrocity ever be ethically separated from their method? These are questions that governments preferred to bury alongside their sealed archives, leaving only fragments for historians to piece together. The disturbing truth is not just what was done at Dachau, but what was done with it afterward. Justice was compromised, morality was bartered, and data gathered through unimaginable cruelty was quietly integrated into the survival strategies of the Western world. The camp may have been liberated in 1945, but the shadows of its experiments stretched far into the Cold War, shaping defense policies and medical knowledge alike. In the silence of those archives behind the stamps of classified and eyes only, the ghosts of Dachau remind us that some victories are built not on justice, but on the deliberate concealment of truth. Chapter 2: Forbidden Pact, Nazi Gold and Allied Banks. In the final years of the Second World War, while battles raged across Europe and millions struggled for survival, another war was being waged in the shadows. This one was not fought with tanks or artillery, but with ledgers, telegrams, and bank vaults. At its heart was Nazi gold, much of it looted directly from Jewish victims, resistance fighters, and occupied nations. While Allied propaganda painted the conflict as a moral crusade, declassified files reveal that beneath the surface, governments and financial institutions were complicit in laundering blood-stained wealth. The story of this forbidden pact between Nazi officials, neutral banks, and certain Allied representatives has been hidden for decades, buried in restricted economic archives under designations such as Operation Safe Haven and Sunrise Correspondence. By 1944, the Reich was collapsing. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets pushing from the east. Yet through neutral states like Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, and Turkey, Nazi leaders sought to secure their stolen fortune. The Reichsbank shipped tons of gold, some confiscated from national reserves of conquered countries, some stripped from dental fillings, jewelry, and even the hair of Holocaust victims, to Swiss institutions such as the Schweizerische Nationalbank. Detailed memoranda seized after the war, coded under Eisenstadt collection, reveal that these transfers were not mere rumors. In one ledger dated March 1944, the Swiss accepted nearly 280 million Swiss francs worth of gold, a significant portion suspected to have originated from the Reich's death camps. Operation Safe Haven was initiated by the US Treasury in 1944 to trace and freeze these illicit assets. Its official purpose was noble: prevent Nazi officials from hiding wealth abroad and financing post-war fascist networks. Yet, its implementation tells a different story. Reports from American diplomats in Lisbon and Bern reveal deliberate obstruction. Banks stonewalled investigators, citing client confidentiality, while certain Allied policymakers quietly argued that pressuring neutral institutions too hard could destabilize the fragile financial balance of Europe. A Treasury memo dated January 1945 stated bluntly, "The exposure of excessive Swiss complicity may irreparably harm Western reconstruction." Translation: it was easier to bury the truth than to risk economic chaos. As the war ended, these secret dealings became even more complex. Declassified OSS telegrams, marked Project Sunrise, describe covert negotiations between Alan Dulles, the future CIA director, and senior Nazi officials seeking favorable surrender terms in Italy. The price of cooperation was not only military concessions but economic protection. In exchange for intelligence and strategic capitulation, certain Nazi elites were assured that their financial networks in neutral countries would remain largely untouched. Allied leaders rationalized this betrayal as a strategic necessity, a way to shorten the war and limit casualties. But in practice, it meant safeguarding fortunes stolen from the dead. The hypocrisy deepens when examining post-war Germany's economic resurrection. The so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle of the 1950s, was celebrated as proof of democracy's triumph over tyranny. Yet, hidden within the seed capital of the Bundesbank and private corporations were assets quietly legitimized after being laundered through Swiss, Portuguese, and Spanish intermediaries. Survivors of the Holocaust filed endless claims for reparations, but many never received justice. Meanwhile, industrial giants such as IG Farben, Krupp, and Daimler-Benz rebuilt using capital whose origins were tied to wartime plunder. The documents confirming this cycle of theft and reinvestment were classified under sensitive economic stability files, effectively locking away the truth for half a century. British archives also revealed damning complicity. MI6 intercepted numerous wartime transmissions highlighting gold transfers through neutral states. But rather than publicly exposing these networks, Whitehall officials prioritized maintaining good relations with Swiss financial elites. The reasoning was simple. In the coming Cold War, Switzerland's banks would be invaluable for covert funding operations. Thus, the atrocities of Nazi theft were quietly set aside in favor of future intelligence priorities. The ledger books, instead of being used in trials, were sealed in economic archives and marked restricted until 2045. The Vatican's role remains equally controversial. Evidence presented in US State Department cables from 1946 suggests that Vatican banking channels were used to funnel Nazi wealth into safe havens in South America. These funds supported escape networks known as rat lines, which enabled war criminals to flee to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. While the Vatican has always denied direct involvement, declassified correspondence indicates at least tacit awareness. Gold stained with the blood of Holocaust victims was converted into passports, travel documents, and safe passage for men like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, who later resurfaced in Latin America. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the theft itself, but the silence that followed. Survivors testified about gold fillings being ripped from corpses at Auschwitz. Railway manifests documented shipments of valuables from extermination camps to the Reichsbank. Allied officials knew this wealth was being smuggled into neutral countries. Yet instead of full transparency, they chose containment. By branding these documents as sensitive, governments prevented outrage that might have demanded real accountability. The moral ledger was balanced not by justice, but by cold calculation. The scandal briefly threatened to surface in the 1990s when independent commissions investigated dormant Swiss accounts linked to Holocaust victims. Families who had lost everything discovered that banks had stonewalled them for decades, demanding death certificates from relatives who perished in gas chambers. After international pressure, settlements were eventually made, but only after years of denial and evasion. The revelations confirmed what survivors had long suspected. The wealth of the dead had been hidden, profited from, and protected by institutions claiming neutrality. The legacy of the Forbidden Pact endures. Much of the gold remains untraceable, its origins laundered through decades of financial transactions. Modern corporations that dominate the European economy still carry silent links to their wartime past. Governments continue to release documents only in fragments, often heavily redacted. And while justice was promised in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the truth is that wealth stolen from the murdered was quietly legitimized to stabilize the very order that emerged after 1945. The disturbing truth buried in these archives is this: while soldiers bled on the battlefield and civilians perished in the camps, bankers, diplomats, and intelligence officers calculated in silence. They understood that money would outlast ideology, and they acted accordingly. World War II ended with the Allies victorious, but in the vaults of Zurich, Lisbon, and beyond, the gold of the Reich ensured that the line between victor and collaborator was far thinner than history books suggest. In those darkened archives, stamped classified, lies the proof that morality was compromised in pursuit of power, and that silence was purchased with stolen gold. Chapter 3: Hidden Massacres on the Eastern Front. When most of the world remembers the Eastern Front of World War II, it recalls images of immense brutality: the German Wehrmacht burning villages, the SS Einsatzgruppen massacring civilians, and entire cities such as Stalingrad or Leningrad reduced to rubble. Yet beneath these already well-documented horrors lies another story, one deliberately obscured by Soviet archives and buried by Western intelligence agencies who feared destabilizing their fragile wartime alliance with Stalin. Declassified fragments, first emerging in the 1990s from Russian state archives, point to a disturbing pattern of massacres not carried out by the Nazis, but by the Red Army itself. Codenamed in reports as Operation Retaliation, these campaigns were directed by the NKVD, Stalin's ruthless internal security force, and targeted civilians living in territories liberated from German occupation. Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine became the epicenters of these hidden atrocities. As the Red Army advanced westward in 1944, villages that had survived years of Nazi occupation suddenly faced a new wave of violence. Official Soviet directives framed these actions as cleansing operations, designed to eliminate collaborators, spies, and enemies of the state. In reality, the criteria were terrifyingly broad. Anyone who had accepted food from German occupiers, anyone accused of speaking German, or even those who had simply survived too long under occupation could be branded a traitor. In village after village, NKVD squads assembled civilians in barns or schoolhouses before executing them en masse. Entire communities disappeared. Their names later struck from maps and censuses. The Katyn massacre of 1940, where over 20,000 Polish officers were executed by Soviet forces, has become infamous as a symbol of Stalin's cruelty. But Operation Retaliation extended the logic of Katyn to a far broader scale. Unlike Katyn, which was eventually exposed through captured German documents and belated Soviet admissions, the massacres of 1944 and 1945 were concealed behind layers of secrecy. Reports were filed in Moscow, stamped special folder, and stored in Politburo-controlled safes. Survivors' testimonies were dismissed as fascist propaganda, and Western governments chose silence. British and American intelligence intercepted disturbing communications via ultra-decrypts, suggesting Soviet troops had carried out mass executions of civilians in eastern Poland. But releasing these details would have risked unraveling the alliance that held the war effort together. Thus, the West looked away. One particularly harrowing case is recorded in a fragmentary NKVD document dated July 1944. It describes liquidation actions in the Belarusian village of Borki. Eyewitness accounts collected decades later confirm that Soviet troops surrounded the settlement, accused villagers of aiding German patrols, and then set the houses ablaze. Those who fled were gunned down. Similar stories emerged in Ukrainian territories, where Red Army soldiers sometimes executed villagers suspected of harboring Ukrainian nationalist sympathies, to Moscow, the line between collaborator and civilian was deliberately erased. Entire populations were marked as disposable if they posed even a hypothetical threat to Soviet control. The justification for these atrocities was always framed in terms of security. Stalin's regime feared partisan uprisings, nationalist movements, and resistance to Soviet authority. By eradicating entire communities, the NKVD sought not only to punish but to terrorize, ensuring that survivors would remain silent. The policy was effective. For decades, the people of these regions rarely spoke openly about their experiences, fearing that any complaint could lead to arrest, deportation, or worse. Even after the war ended, families of the victims were often branded traitors in Soviet records, denied access to education, employment, and housing. Western complicity in concealing these massacres is equally troubling. In 1943, Winston Churchill privately acknowledged that the Katyn massacre was almost certainly committed by the Soviets, but public statements continued to blame the Germans. The same pattern repeated with Operation Retaliation. Ultra-decrypts and eyewitness intelligence reaching London and Washington confirmed that Soviet forces were carrying out widespread executions of civilians. Yet these reports were suppressed, classified under headings such as political sensitivity, do not disseminate. The rationale was simple. The alliance with Stalin was essential to defeating Hitler. To expose Soviet crimes at that moment would have fractured the coalition, potentially prolonging the war. The victims of these massacres were thus sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical necessity. The truth began to emerge only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Historians gained limited access to NKVD and Red Army archives, uncovering references to operations labeled security cleansing and territorial stabilization. Some of these documents bore chillingly bureaucratic language, listing villages neutralized and populations removed. Testimonies gathered from elderly survivors in Poland and Ukraine added human detail to the statistics. They spoke of Soviet officers reading names from lists, children torn from mothers' arms, executions carried out in fields at dawn. The pattern was clear. These were not isolated incidents of battlefield excess. They were deliberate, centrally ordered operations designed to secure Stalin's post-war sphere of influence. Even today, the full scope of these massacres remains hidden. Russian archives remain heavily restricted, with many files reclassified in recent years under the justification of protecting state security. The number of victims is unknown, though estimates suggest tens of thousands, possibly more, were executed during these hidden campaigns. Unlike the victims of Nazi atrocities, whose memory is preserved in museums, memorials, and textbooks, the victims of Soviet massacres often remain nameless, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced. It is a second erasure, one that compounds the crime itself. What makes this truth so disturbing is not merely the violence, but the deliberate concealment. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain had reasons to keep silent. For the Soviets, acknowledging these crimes would have undermined the legitimacy of their role as liberators. For the West, revealing them during or immediately after the war would have exposed uncomfortable truths about wartime alliances. And so the massacres were hidden, their memory suppressed under layers of propaganda, classified documents, and political expediency. The Eastern Front is remembered as a battlefield of unprecedented scale and suffering. But within that suffering lies another story, one still not fully told. The civilians executed not by occupiers, but by those who claimed to free them. It is a reminder that in war, liberation can come with its own kind of terror, and that victors often write history not by revealing the full truth, but by burying it where they hope it will never be found. Chapter 4. The Erased Atrocity of Unit 731. In the frozen plains of Harbin, deep within Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a facility stood that was never marked on any official map. It bore the innocuous title, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But within its walls, behind barbed wire and armed guards, operated Unit 731, the most secretive and grotesque arm of Imperial Japan's wartime machine. From 1937 until the Empire's surrender in 1945, this unit conducted experiments so horrific that even hardened military men recoiled at their descriptions. Prisoners, Chinese civilians, captured Soviets, Koreans, and occasionally Allied POWs, were subjected to biological and chemical weapons tests, vivisections without anesthesia, and forced exposure to plague, cholera, and anthrax. Unlike the chaotic brutality of concentration camps, Unit 731's work was meticulously organized, its results logged in detailed scientific records. What makes this atrocity particularly disturbing is not only the crimes themselves, but the way they were deliberately erased after the war, traded away by victorious powers in exchange for knowledge. Testimonies from surviving guards and fragmentary documents describe conditions of nightmarish precision. Prisoners, euphemistically referred to as maruta, meaning logs, were treated as disposable test subjects. Some were tied to stakes while ceramic bombs filled with fleas carrying bubonic plague were detonated nearby. Others were injected with pathogens and monitored as the disease consumed them, their organs later removed for study while still alive. Women were raped and deliberately infected with syphilis so that doctors could record the disease's progress in utero. Children were dissected for comparative analysis against adults. At its peak, the facility held several thousand prisoners at a time, with death a certainty for all who entered. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the expectation was that those responsible for such atrocities would face justice at war crimes tribunals, just as Nazi doctors did at Nuremberg. But what followed was a calculated betrayal of justice. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, received classified reports detailing Unit 731's activities. Instead of preparing prosecutions, he authorized a secret arrangement. Beginning in late 1945 and formalized by 1947, immunity was granted to Unit 731's senior leadership, including its commanding officer, General Shiro Ishii. In exchange, Ishii and his colleagues turned over their records and offered personal briefings to US military scientists. Memoranda preserved in Washington, labeled Far East, Command Confidential, make the rationale clear. The data gathered through these atrocities was considered invaluable for America's emerging biological warfare program. The US was not alone in this moral compromise. Soviet forces, who had overrun parts of Manchuria in the final days of the war, captured several Unit 731 personnel and conducted trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. Unlike the US, the Soviets publicized the crimes, but their motives were hardly moral outrage. Testimonies and evidence gathered at Khabarovsk were quickly funneled into the USSR's own biological warfare efforts, centered at facilities such as Sverdlovsk. Thus, both superpowers absorbed the fruits of atrocity, embedding them in their Cold War arsenals, while the victims were left voiceless, their suffering erased under layers of classified files. Western textbooks rarely mention Unit 731, and when they do, it is often in passing. This is no accident. During the 1950s and 1960s, US government agencies deliberately downplayed or denied the extent of Japanese biological warfare crimes. Journalists who raised questions found themselves dismissed or stonewalled. Families of victims in China received no recognition, and reparations were systematically denied. Even during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, Unit 731 escaped significant scrutiny as evidence was suppressed under national security claims. The message was clear. Scientific data, no matter how it was obtained, was more valuable than justice. The scale of Unit 731's operations is staggering. Estimates suggest that between 3,000 and 12,000 prisoners were directly killed in its facilities. Indirectly, the numbers climb far higher. Field tests using plague-infected fleas released from aircraft spread disease across Chinese provinces, killing untold thousands of civilians. These operations, documented in Japanese military reports, were designed to assess the feasibility of full-scale biological warfare against enemy cities. Plans existed for attacks on the United States, including the West Coast, using submarine-launched seaplanes carrying plague bombs. These attacks never materialized, but the intent reveals the ambition of Japan's program. The immunity deal reached with Unit 731's leaders ensured that many of its doctors reintegrated into post-war Japanese society without consequence. Some rose to positions of prominence in academia and industry. Shiro Ishii reportedly lived comfortably until his death in 1959, never facing trial. Others became respected professors of medicine, their past hidden in official silence. The victims, meanwhile, remained nameless in government records, their stories carried only by whispered family memory and fragmentary Chinese archives. What emerges from the erased atrocity of Unit 731 is not only a story of inhumanity, but of deliberate concealment. Governments that claimed victory in the name of civilization chose to suppress the truth for strategic gain. In doing so, they ensured that the full weight of justice would never fall upon the perpetrators. Survivors of Nanjing, Harbin, and other afflicted areas lived with the scars, while the world at large was told little or nothing. When fragments of evidence resurfaced in the late 20th century, they shocked the public, but by then, most perpetrators were long dead, and official apologies were carefully worded to avoid legal responsibility. The legacy of Unit 731 lingers in silence. Even today, certain archives remain restricted, withheld under claims of national security. The biological data produced through its crimes seeped into the foundations of Cold War research, influencing everything from containment protocols to bioweapon designs. The ethical contamination cannot be undone. The erased atrocity stands as a stark reminder of how governments, when confronted with the choice between justice and advantage, often choose silence. And in that silence, the victims of Unit 731 remain forgotten, buried not only in mass graves, but in the locked filing cabinets of those who inherited their suffering. The files have been opened, but the questions remain. From the frozen chambers of Dachau to the silent bank vaults of Zurich, from the burned villages of Eastern Europe to the plague-ridden fields of Manchuria, the disturbing truths of the Second World War reveal a war far darker than official history admits. Governments celebrated victory, yet in the shadows they bartered justice for knowledge, sacrificed morality for stability, and concealed atrocities behind stamps marked top secret and eyes only. What was hidden shaped the world that followed. Cold War survival manuals written with Nazi data, Western economies stabilized by stolen gold, political alliances sealed in blood, and biological arsenals constructed on the corpses of the forgotten. These are not isolated scandals, but interconnected fragments of a war that never truly ended. The archives whisper of other files still locked away, of names struck from records, of operations never declassified. How many more disturbing truths lie buried, waiting to surface? And when they do, will the world be prepared to confront the reality that victory was not as pure, nor peace as just as we were taught to believe?